Welcome to Off the Charts Football Podcast. I'm Matt Manocherian of Sports Info Solutions, joined as always by Aaron Schatz of Football Outsiders. Aaron, is it right that that's your brother, Noam Schatz, on the beats?
Yes, indeed. I want to thank my brother Noam for allowing us to use his music so that we have a little bit of intro this year. And if people like that background music, they should check out online Thirdness, spelled with the number 3. That's my brother's electronic music sort of band name.
Very cool. And we'll take this opportunity to remind everybody that the data that we talk about on this podcast is for sale at footballoutsiders.com. You can get our premium charting data, which is recorded by Sports Info Solutions Video Scouts, the same data that NFL and college football teams use. You can find our weekly fantasy projections that are available each week, and you can sign up for a season subscription. We'll start off today talking about a team with some offensive line issues, the Seattle Seahawks. According to Sports Info Solutions charting data, the Seahawks have 22 blown blocks through 2 weeks, a ridiculously high number, including Reese Odiambo, who has 8 just on his own.
When you said you wanted to start by talking about a team with offensive line issues, I didn't know which team you wanted to talk about because that could be a lot of them this year.
That's right. There are quite a few teams having troubles up front. The Giants come to mind for sure with their left tackle.
Yeah, the Cincinnati Bengals are having huge offensive line problems. They're having a big offensive line problems in Indianapolis. What else is new? The interesting thing is not only is that a lot of blown blocks, but of course blown blocks are not bad blocks. They're blocks that are obviously blown. For every blown block that gets counted in charting, there's a number of blocks that are just bad but somewhat kind of held. So the Seattle, offensive line is not good. It's kind of amazing. Seattle running backs have been stuffed at the line or for a loss on 35% of carries so far this year. The NFL average is 20%.
Nothing doing there for them offensively, and that leaves Russell Wilson in a lot of tough situations and running around for his life back there.
Right, and that's been the problem in the past. That was their problem last year. Now, Wilson can cover up for a lot of that. The problem last year was once he gets hurt and that knee got hurt, he no longer could cover up for the issues on the offensive line. So What happens if he gets hurt again this year? What happens if, he loses some of that mobility? Now all of a sudden he's back there like a sitting duck.
Right. It seems kind of interesting that a bunch of these teams that we mentioned, the Bengals with Andy Dalton letting a couple of linemen walk in free agency, the Giants, who everybody knew had issues up front, they draft Evan Ingram and kind of ignore their offensive line in free agency. And Seattle, we've seen over a couple years that they really have never invested in their offensive line very much. They have a few draft picks on their line right now, but not necessarily high picks. So it's interesting that it seems like teams thought that maybe they could scheme around this. Maybe by spreading teams out, they could pass the ball around enough that they wouldn't need to invest in their offensive line. But the early returns on that sort of a strategy have really, really been up in smoke.
Well, yes and no. I think part of what's going on here is not teams not doing their due diligence to improve the offensive line, but teams failing. Doing their due diligence and failing anyway. Yes, there is something to the Tom Cable Seattle problem of constantly, trying to convert defensive linemen into offensive linemen. But, Cincinnati used 2 high picks on tackles that the Bengals thought were going to be the long-term replacements at the tackle position. But Cedric Ogbuhi and Jake Fisher just haven't been very good. And
Yep.
Eric Flowers was like a top 15 pick for crying out loud. So you can't argue that the Giants weren't trying to find themselves a left tackle. They just did a really bad job of it.
Yeah, it seems in the age of these college spread offenses where we know that these offensive linemen aren't being developed in the way that they used to be. It's all just a pass set. Every play is just a pass set in college these days. There's nobody learning to run block, and there's nobody really learning pro concepts. And maybe that's a reason why you see the veteran offensive linemen, a couple of free agent signings seem to be fitting in better where they've been than the young guys. The young guys, there have been some guys that have been big hits, of course, but they've seemed to have been fewer and farther between as in the last couple of years.
True, although we thought the Cleveland offensive line was going to be spectacular with the additions that they made in free agency, plus the holdover of Joe Thomas and the return from injury of Joel Bitonio. Yet through 2 games, Cleveland is 30th in the league in adjusted line yards and 31st in adjusted sack rate.
Right, and I do think that Deshaun Kaiser holding onto the ball might have something to do with that.
Definitely with the sack rate.
Yeah, maybe not with line yards.
Quarterbacks
sure.
do have a lot to do with sack rate. It's not just about the offensive line. But, I mean, it's tough. Even when you think you've built a great offensive line, sometimes it doesn't work out. Certainly, I mean, I don't think anybody expected Dallas's offensive line to have the problems last week that it did, and that's an offensive line that almost every week is spectacular.
Right, yeah, they had that first issue, and you start to see a free agent loss over the offseason. Are they going to be able to hold up? At first, they looked like the same old Cowboys, but now maybe a chink in the armor that we saw last week. We'll keep an eye on that.
I think one of the stronger offensive lines people do think is stronger is probably Philadelphia. The questions there are a lot more about the receivers and especially the quarterback. And I think what we're seeing this year with Carson Wentz is a lot more downfield passing, almost like he's been reading Scott Kazmar's Twitter feed and wants to prove him wrong.
Right. Everything last year was about air yards with Carson Wentz, and it's dink and dunk this and dink and dunk that. And in my opinion, it was really good. It was good play design for a young quarterback. Now, what has he done this year? He is just 6 for 21 on throws more than 15 yards downfield. So what is that, 6 for 21? Let's put that into context. The 21 attempts ties him with Carson Palmer for second in attempts behind Tom Brady. So he has been throwing the ball downfield more. And last year he was 15th in the NFL in deep attempts. However, being 6 for 21 has Carson Wentz at the lowest completion percentage in the league, with the exception of, as we were discussing before, Russell Wilson. So we're seeing a lot more downfield throws, but not necessarily the success on those downfield throws.
Yeah, I think the interesting question with Wentz is how much can be blamed on the receivers. You heard a lot of that from Philly fans last year, that the problem was the quality of the receivers. Well, now he's got 2 new receivers. The one holdover is Nelson Aguilar, but Aguilar has been pretty good this year. I don't think you can really critique him too much how he's played this year. So I don't know if you can blame it on the receivers, the lack of connection on those deep passes.
Yeah, we'll certainly have to see some development in his game. Now that he's attempting those throws more, now we'll see if he can pick up the success rate. Another interesting thing that I noticed about Wentz is that only Tom Brady has seen more man coverage than Carson Wentz. So specifically, teams have been playing a lot of cover 1 versus Wentz. That's man coverage on the receivers with 1 deep safety over the middle. Now, Wentz is 19th in the NFL in completion percentage versus cover 1 at just 59%. So he's down there with the likes of Brian Hoyer, Josh McCown, Andy Dalton. But both of his interceptions came against zone coverage teams. So even though he's only completing 59% of those passes against cover 1, he's protected the football and he doesn't have any interceptions there. So with more of the interceptions coming against zone, even though he's barely seeing zone at all, I wonder if teams are going to start adjusting and actually playing more zone against Carson Wentz as the year progresses.
I will say that Tom Brady and Carson Wentz seeing the most man coverage suggests that what you may actually be partially measuring there is the use of man coverage by the Kansas City Chiefs. Because what is the defense that has played both Tom Brady and Carson Wentz? It's the Kansas City Chiefs, who play a lot of man coverage, especially because they want Marcus Peters picking the ball off. That's why Brady didn't really throw at Marcus Peters in the first game. He was just trying to pick on the guys on the other side. Right,
and astute observation. That's how the Chiefs hang, and it makes sense that that's a lot of what these teams have seen. Another guy who's been maligned as a dink and dunk passer is Alex Smith. And Alex Smith also, throughout the beginning of this year, has come out and thrown the ball downfield in a way that we didn't expect and we haven't seen from him before.
Yeah, it's really surprising, and it's put Alex Smith in a place you normally wouldn't find him. Alex Smith is currently 3rd in the league in passing DVOA for guys with at least 30 passes thrown. Of course, the deep throw can't be all the time for Alex Smith. He still is, on average, throwing short of the sticks on 3rd down, so some things will never change.
Right. So last year we saw Alex Smith. He was 27th in deep attempts with 39% completions, 3 touchdowns, and 2 picks. So he didn't throw the ball deep at all last year. The eye test matches there. But actually this year, even though it seems like he's throwing the ball downfield a lot, he's only attempted 10 passes that traveled more than 15 yards downfield, and he's 5 for 10 on those throws. That said, he's got 2 touchdowns and no interceptions, so when called upon, he's been much more effective than he was over the whole last year.
Yeah, I have a feeling that in the long term, this one may be more of a statement about the Patriots' defense because a lot of that deep stuff was in that first game. But if it's a statement about the Patriots' defense, it's not a statement that Patriots fans will want to hear.
Right, and if it's a statement about Smith, I'd say that from a statistical standpoint, based on what we've seen so far, his attempt rate is up a little bit on these deep throws, but from a statistical standpoint, there's little reason to believe that we have a new Alex Smith, and I would expect his results to regress to the mean over the course of the year. One thing he has done this year, though, is he's crushed it versus zone. He's been absolutely lights out, 20 for 25 with 11.6 yards per attempt and an 128 rating. And this is in a season where most QBs have had more success against man than zone so far in the early going. And Alex Smith has really stood out against the zone schemes.
Yeah, it's interesting. You can't expect the team you're playing against to blow cover 2 and let Tyreek Hill run for 9,000 yards on every play.
Very true. Another team that's known for short passing is the Miami Dolphins, who played their first game on Sunday. And they did some interesting things as we saw Jay Cutler distribute the targets a little bit differently than we had in the past. So we saw Jarvis Landry get 15 targets, which a very Landry-like figure. He had 13 completions on those 15 targets, but only 78 yards. So he had an 87% completion percentage, but only 5.2 yards per target. Even more stunning, on the 13 receptions, he had just 21 yards before the catch versus 57 after the catch. So less than 2 air yards per reception. Meanwhile, on the other side of the field, DeVante Parker was targeted more often by Cutler than Tannehill, but he only caught 4 out of 9 targets. His 44% completion rate doesn't sound very good, but the 9.4 yards per target is almost double that of Landry. Also, all 4 of his completions came for first downs, and Parker didn't have a drop. In fact, he salvaged a completion out of what should have been an interception. So Landry's a great player, but by raising his usage so high, I'm wondering if the Dolphins have turned him into a less efficient weapon than what he used to be. And then on the other side, looking at Parker, it'll be interesting to see that as his success figures to lead to greater usage, if he can maintain the efficiency that he showed in week 1.
I will say that I don't think that they've changed how efficient Landry is. I think Landry's always been this guy. They just sort of reached the reductio ad absurdum of using him. Because Jarvis Landry has always been all short passes all the time, constantly short of the sticks. He is the leader in what we call failed completions, which are completions that don't meet our baseline for success, less than 100% of the yards on third down, less than 60% on second down, less than 45% on first down. He tied Julian Edelman's record for the fewest yards by somebody with 13 or more catches in this game. And I am remembering here some research that we did both in Football Outsiders Almanac and that Scott Kazmar expanded upon on the website then in August, where he compared Jarvis Landry to a number of other number 1 receivers in the league over the last 3 years and did a correlation coefficient of how good the pass offense was by DVOA and how often the teams threw to each receiver. And Jarvis Landry was one of only 2 receivers in the league where there was actually a negative correlation between how often he caught the ball and how good the team offense was. The only other one was Sammy Watkins, and that was kind of, it was a little bit of a fluke because of certain specific games, because Watkins had played fewer games because he has so many injuries. But there's really nobody who compares with Landry when it comes to that his teams don't actually do better when he catches a lot of ball. For example, in games of the last 3 years, when Jarvis Landry had 10 or more targets, the Dolphins are 5-16. Compare that to the Patriots in games where Julian Edelman had 10 or more targets, 19-1.
And the Patriots, I think, in general, have a better record than the Dolphins. But the
True,
point stands.
But you can, compare other guys, too. DeAndre Hopkins in games where he had at least 10 targets. The Houston Texans, 14-10 over the last 3 years. And that's not a team that's been a great team. Golden Tate in games where he's had 10 or more targets over the last 3 years. His teams are 13-7. Larry Fitzgerald's team's 13-5-1. So Landry is very different from other receivers in that the more you throw to him, the less often his team wins. The only real comparison among number one receivers is a guy who's known not for short targets, but for garbage time targets, and that's Allen Robinson. Jacksonville 4-16 in games where he gets 10 or more targets.
So I would look at that a little bit different than you, Aaron. I think what's going on here is not that by targeting Jarvis Landry or Allen Robinson that somehow the team is doing something to lower their chance of winning, except that what they're doing is they're overfeeding and they're on the wrong side of the efficiency versus usage kind of paradigm. This is a very popular topic. I know the basketball analytic nerds will really like this one. The usage versus efficiency. So you might be a 60% shooter over when you're playing 5 minutes per game, but all of a sudden you become a 30 minutes per game player and your shooting percentage drops to 48%. And this is an interesting topic in the NBA. It's why James Harden was so sought after in his trade before, based on the analytics, which said he's had low usage, he's been great efficiency, and we have evidence to think when he becomes a higher usage player, he can maintain that efficiency. Jarvis Landry, and for that matter, Allen Robinson, seem to be so relied on by their offenses over the past couple of years that their usage is too high, and it's affecting their efficiency in a negative way.
Yes, I agree with you. I don't think that this is a statement that these are bad players or can't be useful players. I think this is a statement that these offenses are not necessarily structured well. Although I think Robinson is also a statement of, we know how Blake Bortles rolls, right? This is also partially a statement that they're going to throw him 5 balls once they're down 21 points in the fourth quarter. With Jarvis Landry, this is more about using him early on in a lot of third and medium, third and long situations, throwing the ball short of the stick, and he gets a catch, but he doesn't move the sticks.
Right. I'll be interested to see as the year goes on if the Dolphins can find a kind of new normal as it pertains to Landry, Parker, and for that matter, Stills, and kind of their target distribution. Moving forward, it's time for our most important game of the week. Aaron, what do we have this week?
Well, we have 2 games that are kind of neck and neck for most important game of the week for playoff purposes. The first one is the Atlanta Falcons at the Detroit Lions, the shocking 2-0 Detroit Lions, who are the only team in the NFC alone in first place. And based on our playoff odds, Atlanta's playoff odds are different by 22.6%, depending on whether they win or lose, and Detroit's changed by 21.3%. The other one that's very close is Buffalo and Denver, where Buffalo's odds changed by 19.5% and Denver's by 23.6%.
So let's unpack that Atlanta-Detroit game first. The thing that I'm excited to see there, and I think I'm not alone in this, is the quarterback play. We saw Matt Stafford get his big contract over the offseason. We saw Matt Ryan with his MVP year last year, and they haven't disappointed in the early going. Right now, we track a statistic called Independent Quarterback Rating, IQR, here at Sports Info Solutions. And what that does is it's your traditional quarterback rating, except it subtracts out things that the quarterback can't control, like drops, throwaways, spikes, Hail Marys, anything that would be outside of the realm of what the quarterback is contributing to the play is dropped out of the IQR formula, and we recalculate the traditional quarterback rating based on only what the quarterback has contributed. On this scale, Stafford is 4th in the league with an IQR of 129, and Matt Ryan is right behind him with 5th at 124.
I do think it's interesting. A lot of the story this year with Atlanta was, the offense probably would regress a bit, but would the defense make up for it with improvement? Now, it's only been 2 games, and this is not opponent adjusted yet. And, of course, Green Bay is a team that has a good offense and a bad defense. But so far, Atlanta is 4th in the league in offense by our ratings and 23rd in defense. So actually, it's kind of like the offense hasn't really regressed, but the defense hasn't really stepped forward to pick up where the offense needed them to either. And, of course, Vic Beasley is going to be gone for about a month, I think, and that's going to really hurt the Atlanta pass rush. Meanwhile, Detroit, number 1 special teams in the league so far this year, and a really good defense, which is kind of crazy because they had the worst defense in the league last year, but their defense has been outstanding this year Again, obviously, you have to think about who they played. Giants with the problems they're having on offense, the Cardinals with the problems they're having on offense, but they've played against those two teams really well, much better than the Detroit defense would have been against them last year.
That seems to be a big theme of the stats that we talk about in the early going of the season, and a cautionary tale not to overreact too much. We had our overreaction week last week, but even still, we just have 2 games worth. It's not that much football that's been played.
Well, I mean, shoot, I think everybody overreacted on Denver as if it was week 1, forgetting that week 1 ever happened. I mean, I turned on NFL Network on, I think, Monday morning, and they were talking about Denver as the favorite in the AFC West. Now, I mean no disrespect to the Broncos, and certainly it looks so far like Football Outsiders' poor projection for the Broncos will turn out to be incorrect. But it's not like they're the only 2-0 team in their division. There are 2 other 2-0 teams in their division, and each of those teams beat a good team on the road, whereas Denver won both of its games at home. And Denver was really close with the Chargers in the first game, and only a blocked field goal kept that game from overtime. So I think the sort of crowning of the Broncos, yes, the win over Dallas was hugely impressive. But was it really more impressive than what Kansas City did in New England the week before? Was it really that much more impressive than Oakland going to Nashville and beating Tennessee pretty handily, despite the fact that the score was a little closer than the play-by-play? I think it's a really strong division, but that's part of what makes this game important for playoff spot for Denver, because it's a good chance that two of those 3 teams are going to be fighting for a wild card. Only one of those 3 teams can get in by winning the AFC West.
Right. They seem like one of the strongest divisions in football, and it's fascinating with Denver. Obviously, on paper, has the best defense of all those teams, but I think on paper we'd also say that they come 4th place in quarterbacks. And don't sleep on Phil Rivers and the Chargers, who've lost 2 games in heartbreaking fashion, but they're 2 kicks away from being 2-0, just like the rest of the teams in their division.
Denver is 12th in DVOA so far this year. The Chargers are 13th. They are like basically neck and neck. It's just kind of bad bounces, bad field goal bounces that have gotten the Chargers to 0-2. And if I ran something for ESPN that said that if they were in the AFC South playing the Indianapolis schedule instead, their playoff odds would go from something like 14% to something like 23%, because they're just stuck, despite being by far the best of the 0-2 teams. They're stuck in this division with 3 2-0 teams. But Buffalo is actually, they've been as good as Denver so far this year until you apply opponent adjustments. But this is one place where, of course, you have to, in your mind, apply opponent adjustments, even if it's too early to do it, in the numbers. Because, yes, maybe Dallas is not good. Yes, maybe the Jets are better than they've shown so far. But probably Dallas is good and the Jets are terrible. So the Bills are not quite as good as they've looked. And Denver is even better maybe than they've looked, because it is difficult to beat Dallas.
Right, and I'm looking forward in that Buffalo-Denver game to 2 teams that like to run the ball more than pass the ball, and 2 teams that also defend the pass very well. Denver has allowed opponents a rating of just 69 this year, while the Bills have allowed an opposition quarterback rating of just 62. So both these teams are in the top of the league in that category. They have good run defenses as well. I would expect what a traditional football fan would call a boring game, and what a football enthusiast like me and you would call a very interesting game that'll have a huge impact on playoff odds. Moving on to the next section of the podcast, we have a very special guest, Ryan Hollern, an NFL scout who's worked with the New Orleans Saints and the Buffalo Bills. Hey, Ryan, how's it going?
Man, what's up, man? Good to be on, man. Appreciate you having me on off the charts, man. Thank you.
And I appreciate you calling me Mano. For any listeners out there who don't know, I'm Matt Manocherian, of course, but a lot of friends will call me Mano. So Ryan and I worked back with the Saints together, and I'm still Mano to him. So for the rest of this podcast, get used to it. So Ryan, what have you been up to lately? Last time we were working together, we were both with the Saints. Since then, we've each been with different teams. Tell me about your life.
Well, as far as the football background, really started off at Mississippi State, working in the recruiting department for a few years. That led me to the Saints. I was with the Saints 7 or 8 years, Combine Scout, Area Scout. Loved doing that. And then most recently last year, I was with Buffalo as their college scouting coordinator. So smorgasbord of evaluator duties so far.
So you mentioned your experience, and you started off at Mississippi State, but you also said when you came to the Saints, you had a couple of different scouting jobs. Can you describe what goes into each of those different jobs for people that might not know?
Sure.
So you started off as the national scout with the Saints, correct?
Yeah, yep, the NFL Scout, Combine Scout, that's correct.
So NFS, for people that don't know, that's the organization that runs the Combine, and about 20 or so teams will subscribe to their scouting services where they're actually pool their scouts together for the purposes of NFS reports.
The NFL Scout, National Football Scouting, usually has about 11 scouts from one each from a team that's in the organization. Their primary duty is to go out in the spring and do the junior pro days, the upcoming seniors, and they get to measure the kids, talk with the kids, watch film, write reports, and all that information gets shared with each team that's in NFS. And kind of what that will do is that'll kind of give a guide for the area scouts coming up in the following fall, just kind of a basic outline of the prospects at each school, some measurables, some verified times, height, weight, hand, arm, just to help out the area guys, and that's kind of what it is.
So while all the senior scouts are going around to different pro days watching the senior prospects, it's a lot of the guys at NFS that are checking out the juniors as they have their pro day and timing those guys and creating the foundation of reports for the guys that'll go into next year's draft. Very cool.
Yep, that's correct. Yeah.
Very cool. So since you left the Bills, what have you been up to?
Most recently, I've been kind of working a little bit with Inside the League, run by Neil Stratton.
Yeah,
and,
I know Neil well.
And what we kind of do is what I've been doing is we have a little segment called Scouts View, and it's on Twitter. It's ITL Scouts View, and there's a handful of former NFL scouts that each do a game each weekend, and we just like we would do on an official school visit, is we just kind of throw out some descriptions of the players and what we see and what we like and dislike, just like we would do on a regular basis.
Yeah, I think it's awesome. I've checked it out last couple of weeks, and besides getting really interesting opinions, it gives you a great sense of the type of terms that scouts use, the type of things that they're looking for, and kind of it brought me right back to the day of being a scout and being in the stadium and the sorts of notes that I'd be taking. So I think it's awesome. I encourage everybody to check that out. What's the Twitter handle again? At ITL Scouts View?
That's correct, yeah. And there's also at Inside the League, too, as well. So that has a lot of NFL and college news. It really pertains to agents, scouts, and prospects. So I would check that out as well. Excellent.
So, Ryan, changing gears a little bit, you've been out watching a few players this year and checking out the film as you always do. And I've been cooped up here in our office in Allentown, running the numbers with our team of video scouts, charting everything. And one thing that I'd like to talk about a little bit is seeing where some of the scouting, what you see when you watch these guys and you're studying them, where that aligns or where it doesn't align with what the analytics say and the sort of things that we're tracking. So I don't think there's ever going to be a day in football where scouts are no longer needed and we can replace it all with analytics. I don't think that's the intention at all, and I don't think people that have a lot of understanding of analytics have that as a goal in mind. But what we can do is use it as a tool and a cross-reference so that we can see when our opinions and the objective things align. So, having said all that, what players have you watched this year that have stood out to you?
Well, I would say the first prospect that I've watched that had a great game was Baker Mayfield against Ohio State about 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, that was outstanding. So Baker Mayfield's an interesting guy for us. He's really projected as just a mid-round pick, and I think that mostly has to do with his height. But when we looked at his 2016 passing numbers, he was absolutely off the chart. He had the top quarterback rating in college football last year at 135, over 300 yards a game, 70% completions, 40 touchdowns to 8 interceptions. What did you see when you watched him against Ohio State?
Well, there's a few traits to me that stood out about him that you're going to have in your quarterback. And I believe that most scouts that watch him this year, somewhere in their report, they're going to have moxie, they're going to have competitive, they're going to have winner, and they're going to have playmaker in that report. He showcased all those traits on a big stage that Saturday night 2 weeks ago, and it was really fun to watch. When I kind of broke him down a little bit more as a prospect, I was really impressed with his accuracy. And not to dig too much into analytics, Mano, but this young man started out his first year as a starter at 64% completion, and each year he went to 68% to 70%, and this senior year right now he's at 76% completion percentage. So it not only shows his progression in his offense that he can get better, but those numbers are really outstanding. Two other things to note is the kid, and I think you said something correct, that height could be an issue, but he's not a small kid. He's listed at 220 pounds. Plenty of arm talent. He can throw it around, and I think what an important trait is I thought he did a really good job of making some funny body throws 2 weekends ago.
So maybe a bit of a different personality type, but as you describe him, he sounds a little bit like Russell Wilson. Is that a fair comp?
Yeah, I couldn't argue that comp. I think so because of the height, the playmaking ability, the accuracy on the run. Sure, absolutely. And
of course, the sticking the flagpole into midfield obviously shows off that competitiveness, right?
Yeah, that's emotions of the game. I don't think any scout would really get too upset or bothered by that, to be honest.
Right, no doubt. One guy that I saw that stood out for me on Oklahoma, and I'm curious to think if you think he has any chance in the NFL, is Ogbonnia Arankwo, if I said his name correctly. He popped out with 9 sacks and 49 pressures in 2016. However, he's just 6 foot, 240 with about 4.7 estimated speed. So not somebody with the athletic traits that have scouts gushing. Did he catch your eye at all?
He did. He was the next guy I had listed. And, Mano, I'm glad that you had to go and pronounce his name, and I didn't have to. Good job on that. No, I thought he had an excellent game against the Ohio State tackles on both sides. The one thing that you hit is he's not a big guy as far as mass, but he is well built. But edge rushers, even though a little shorter and not weigh as much, especially in a 34 and odd man front, that gives them some natural leverage. They can go and get the arc, flatten and bend. And this kid, what I liked about him was he hunted the quarterback. He really got after it all game, and I think that's a very important trait for pass rushers in the NFL.
So maybe a best fit as a 3-4 outside backer and a shorter guy a little bit in the James Harrison, Dwight Freeney mold. We've seen short guys and undersized guys be successful before.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I watched him and I kind of put in my notes, he reminded me a little bit of Buffalo Bills defensive end Jerry Hughes, actually.
Uh-huh. Well, you've watched Jerry Hughes very up close and personal, so I'm sure that's a close alignment. What about from the Ohio State side? Any players from there stand out to you?
Well, I thought one player that really stood out, and I don't like to dip into underclassmen too much, but Draymond Jones, their redshirt sophomore defensive tackle, really looked like the real deal to me.
Yeah, what did you see there?
What I saw was an explosive athlete, great takeoff and twitch, violent hands, the ability from an inside player, especially in that B gap, to penetrate and disrupt from inside the pocket, which is really important for your pass rush for a scheme. It's athletic, can run, very impressed with him.
So you talk about him being a B-gap player, and I haven't studied him, so I'm taking that to mean, so for people that don't know, the B-gap being the gap between the guard and the tackle, I'm taking that to mean he plays more 3 technique than a true nose, and he's a little bit more of a move guy?
Absolutely correct, yeah. He would probably be a standout for any 4-3 defense in the NFL. But his athletic ability combined with his size, he could even probably slide out to defensive end in certain packages. So the more you can do, the better.
And the dirty little secret that you let out, that scouts always have their eyes on the underclassmen, whether they're coming out or not. Everybody's keeping an eye on the freak athletes.
Yep, and for me, this kid more stood out, and I had to take notes on him, and that's a good thing.
Great. Who else did you want to discuss today?
From last week, I was fortunate enough to watch two quarterbacks. The first quarterback was Mason Rudolph, as I did the Oklahoma State first pick game. And at the last weekend at night, I was able to watch Nick Fitzgerald, Mississippi State versus LSU, and I came away very impressed with both of those young men.
So here are some guys, unlike Baker Mayfield, big frame guys. Mason Rudolph near the top of a lot of people's boards with 63% completions last year, 28 touchdowns to 4 interceptions. Here was the stat that I loved about him. He had more air yards than any other quarterback with a rating over 100 last year. So there were several quarterbacks with ratings over 100, but nobody had more yards through the air than Mason Rudolph. That means he's completing deeper balls and not getting as much yards after the catch. Deshaun Watson was the guy who was second place on that list last year, and we see he's already getting snaps on Sundays.
When I watched Rudolph's performance last week, he did what he was supposed to as your job was. He put the ball on the body, and he was able to step into his throws, drive those intermediate throws, keep his receiver on the move. I came away really impressed with his mechanics in the pocket, his delivery. He has good touch on the ball. I've watched quarterbacks in the wide open spread offense where they have time and there's the windows, the lanes for them to throw is really big. So you can't knock the quarterback for being in that system. I think probably at some game this season when scouts watch Rudolph, they're going to want to see him in more of a pressure environment where the pocket isn't as clean, the windows aren't as big, and see how he performs in those games. But I thought his performance against Pitt was really good. Yeah,
with some of these Big 12 quarterbacks, that's always going to be something to keep in mind, something that's always going to be talked about with them. How about James Washington, his receiver out there, who's a highly ranked guy? What'd you see out from him?
Yeah, I like this kid a lot. I like his game a lot. And what I mean by that is I saw an explosive athlete who went up to get the ball. And when I break down plays hungry for a receiver, that's a good thing. Strong hands, box out defenders, and, of course, what everybody likes in your receivers is what they can do after the catch. Very explosive, short area burst. And, when he had the ball in his hand, this kid was trying to get as many yards and get upfield as much as he could. I liked him a lot.
So he's kind of an interesting player from a statistical standpoint because I said Mason Rudolph, his quarterback, completed 63% of his passes last year. Washington, when he was targeted, it was only a 53% completion percentage. That said, he averaged more than 10 yards per target. So you can imagine when he actually did complete the passes, he was getting huge gains all over the field. So that goes in right with what you're saying. Explosive playmaker.
Yep, and he showcased that against Pitt as well last weekend.
So you mentioned Nick Fitzgerald, too. Nick Fitzgerald is a curious one for a lot of people that might just look at the stat sheet. Here's a guy last year who completed 55%, under 7 yards per attempt. His passer rating of 84 was 89th in the FBS. So what is it possibly about a quarterback with those kind of numbers that you're talking about him being somebody that you liked?
Well, I would say first, for Nick Fitzgerald, dual threat quarterback, he's a big athlete. He's listed at 6'5", 230 pounds. And a little bit of his background, a stat that I was wowed by, was this kid only threw 76 passes in high school. I mean, wow. that just doesn't happen these days. And I think Mississippi State's done a great job. And Dan Mullen, he's kind of has that little quarterback school history of guys that he's coached and developed. And that's a key word when you're talking about quarterback prospects. Right. And I think Nick Fitzgerald continues to develop and get better as a quarterback. Against LSU and very good defense with very good athletes, I really saw a confident decision maker pre-snap and post-snap. I thought his accuracy and ball placement was really good. I came away really impressed with him.
Very interesting. So high upside guy, like you said, big, athletic, and developing. So we'll continue to see how that development goes, but certainly the way he played against LSU is gonna speak well for him. Anybody else from that game you wanted to discuss?
Well, I think LSU's running back, Darius Geis, is definitely a very good player, very good prospect. Because the game got away, as the Bulldogs played tremendous that night, may not be his best showcase game, but this kid has all the traits that you want in a running back.
Yeah, he certainly looks the part, and he was 6th in the FBS in broken tackles last year, and he's continued that so far this year. Oftentimes you'll see LSU play from under center, and I think that's a reflection on the guys that they've had playing running back for them and the focus of their offense. And when you see a guy like Geis, it's mostly rightfully so. What did you see from Arden Key in that game?
You know, for Arden Key, this was his first game back. He missed the first 2 games of the year. I go into a scout code, and if I don't make a school call and I don't know anything about the background, I'm just watching a player on tape and I'm grading the tape. I think Arden Key he's a really talented player. His height, weight, speed, athletic ability. He has a lot of things physically that other prospects won't have. It was his first game back, and he did have a lot of production last year. But in my opinion, he's going to have to bring it every single play with a little bit more physicality. Luckily for him, he has 9 more games this season to showcase that.
So Arden Key, 6'6", just about 230 pounds, the way he's listed by the school. So a big, long guy, good athleticism, like you say, and big production last year, 10 sacks and 42 total pressures. To me, he sounds like, it reminds me of if you were to write up Barkevious Mingo and Jason Taylor, if you were to write those 2 guys up coming out of school, they probably would have really similar write-ups. And Arden Key sounds like he's right in that mold, and kind of distinguishing between, is he a Mingo or is he a Taylor? I think that'll be a lot of what we're focusing on for the rest of the season.
I could see that argument, and when you said Mingo, a former LSU player, you kind of hit it right on the head. The one thing evaluators, when they're watching that defensive end, that pass rusher, is when they can't beat that tackle purely on athletic ability, they have to go to that power game. They got to be able to engage, pull the guy back, rip off. And for Key, that will be key in his next step in his progression as a rusher, is building up that strength and being able to go to that whenever the athletic ability to beat the guy outside isn't working that day.
Fascinating. Is there anybody else that you wanted to discuss from the guys that you've watched this year?
One thing I want to discuss, because a lot of times you always discuss the high-profile guys, and for most scouts, when they go into a school, you're always looking for maybe a little hidden gem or somebody who's not, up on the billboard. You're looking for a guy that can help us out. Last weekend, I just kind of, a little segment I call Caught My Eye. Jordan Thomas, the tight end from Mississippi State.
Yeah.
He's listed at 6'5", 280 pounds. And what they do with this kid, big kid, and what they do with him, they'll detach him. They'll line him up out wide. He'll run the out routes, the slants, the curls, but they'll also bring him inside. And sometimes they'll leave him alone blocking the defensive end solo, which is just him. I find that very unique, very intriguing, and I'm sure an NFL tight end coach will as well.
Oh, those guys would go crazy for it. You give them a guy that can block, and they go nuts, and rightfully so.
Yeah. So big athlete. He does his part in the Mississippi State offense, but honestly, I think this kid, through the pro days, in that process, he'll rise, in my opinion.
Okay, moving ahead. You're going to be watching a couple of games this weekend on the ITL Twitter feed. Where are you going to be, and who are you excited to see?
I'm going to be watching West Virginia and Kansas this weekend, and I'm looking forward to some players at West Virginia, specifically Kaiser White, their safety. He's a big kid, He already had some ball production and tackle production this year, so I'll be able to check him out. Kayron White, the receiver, again, another receiver in West Virginia's offense. They usually put up good stats. So those are two of the guys that I'll be checking out.
Well, I'll be excited to see what you think of these players over the weekend. Again, will you give us the Twitter handle where you'll be?
Yep, it'll be ITL Scouts View.
At ITL Scouts View. We'll be excited to watch it. And, of course, you can catch me at sportsinfo_SIS and Aaron Schatz at FB Outsiders. Charting data and projections are from sale from Sports Info Solutions, and we'll have more scouts on over the course of the season. Ryan, hopefully we'll see you again. You can subscribe to us on iTunes by searching for Off the Charts, and we'll talk to you next week.